the other countries were quite essential under the working conditions. That brings me to our next panelist, Sergio. Basically, we know that the EU has amended its approach to trade and sustainable development, especially over the last 5 years. So in the interest, again, of time, I'm going to be throwing a lot of questions at you. But it would be great to hear maybe, what are the most significant achievements that the EU has reached, especially with the implementation of the 2022 TSD strategy. And also, if you could share, what are some thoughts on next steps for the EU to harness further environmental commitments from its trade partners and to also strengthen mutual partnerships? So.
Sure, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, the mics really need to be close.
Okay. Good. So thanks very much and for the invitation, and it's a pleasure for me to be here, taking over from York, my colleague who has to be at the European Parliament. Okay, good. So yes, as you know, probably, the European Union has included TSD chapters in its FTAs since 2011. Korea was the first agreement which had a full-fledged TSD chapter. There had been in the past sustainability provisions on labor and environment, but clearly that was the first one. And the communication of 2022 was the occasion to review the state of play of where we were. And following a 1-year consultative process, set some parameters for the way ahead. I'm not going to go into the depth of the communication because probably you are aware of that, and the question is about what have you been doing after that. Clearly, the communication puts the sustainability at the core of trade policy and of trade agreements. In this case, the communication is about the role of sustainability in trade agreements. Since then, we have concluded a number of trade agreements with strong TSD chapters. New Zealand in June of 22, that entered into force last year in May. We had Kenya, the Kenya-European Partnership, Economic Partnership Agreement, concluded in 23 and which entered into force last year in June of 2024. We have just set up now, or we're setting up rather, the domestic advisory group for this agreement. The Angola Sustainability Investment Facilitation Agreement of which entered into force also last year, and then the Chile FTA that entered into force last month. All of them, they include ambitious TSD chapters subject to dispute settlement. Then, of course, since then as well, we have concluded a number of negotiations which are heading towards the ratification phase, or they are in the middle of it. Of course, Mercosur FTA concluded last December, Mexico in January, and we have some EPCAs that are non-preferential agreements, but still with TSD chapters that are very substantive with Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. And then, of course, we have all the FTAs which are already in force. There are many with strong TSD chapters, and we are working on the implementation, and I will cover them in particular. Other than that, we have, of course, key negotiations ongoing, which also have TSD chapters that we are aiming at with the same level of ambition. Of course, we have an India FTA negotiation, that is a difficult one. Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and we are opening Malaysia FTA soon. All of them, we are aiming at FTAs with TSD chapters, with binding commitments subject to dispute settlement in the frame of the 2022 TSD communication. Now, in terms of the implementation of these commitments, and there are some questions about what these commitments are in detail. In terms of environment, they include binding commitments to effectively implement multilateral environmental agreements across the board, not only on climate change, but also, of course, on biodiversity, CBD, CITES. I would not categorize climate as being above the biodiversity conventions in our trade agreements. There are individual articles for each area. We have an overall article which covers all environmental agreements, and there are specific articles for climate change, but also for biodiversity, and even for forestry, and also for marine biological resources. So we go to a level of detail which is quite remarkable. Now, in terms of the implementation of all this, actually it is now relatively easy to see where we stand, because we have just commissioned an external study that has just been issued last month by an independent professor that presented together with our director the report of the ex post analysis on the implementation of the environmental provisions in TSD chapters of FTAs. That was presented in a civil society dialogue last month. That was attended by quite a number. Maybe some of you were around. Now, the study, which is 200 pages, and of course it's public, it's quite long. I will not go into all details, but it includes some key parameters that are considered to be satisfactory and certainly not impacting negatively. And the whole exercise was to see what was the impact of the FTA as a whole, not only of the TSD chapters, in the environmental footprint, or rather, what is the footprint of this? In terms of the conclusions of the report, it looks at 5 parameters. The ratification and compliance by EU partners of the multilateral environmental agreements. It looks at regulatory cooperation on environmental areas, non-regression of domestic law, alliance building in multilateral forum, as well as green climate friendly technologies. On all these areas, the implementation aspects are positive, and overall, the conclusion of the report is that they have contributed positively to the objectives of this. Now, in addition to some macro parameters, which again, I would encourage you to look at the report. There are some micro studies as well of 20 case studies that look more into the detail on some aspects of how these agreements, in particular the environmental provisions, have an impact on the ground. We have, the consultant itself has selected a number of these FTAs. Vietnam in relation to biodiversity, Honduras with coffee, Colombia with palm oil, Georgia, Peru. I could name a number of them. Also in relation to developed countries, for Japan, for the access and reform on offshore wind development, and also in Vietnam in relation to waste management. I would conclude, just to be brief, that we are convinced that the approach of having binding commitments on environmental grounds in our FTAs, in our TSD chapters, with a level of detail which is unparalleled and subject to dispute settlement, is positive. Nevertheless, it has to be accompanied with a strong cooperation arm. There is no way that we can enforce environmental objectives without providing with cooperation. And this is an important part, and most of these success stories are not the result of the provisions themselves alone, but rather the framework for cooperation and for regulatory exchanges, coupled with projects on the ground that have been prioritized in terms of these agreements, because precisely we have these binding provisions and that we do not want to fail. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your intervention and for also bringing up this very, how would I say, enlightening study. For those who may not know, IEEP also contributed to the work in that report, so highly recommend that you take a look. And I would agree with Sergio that dialogue and cooperation between trade partners is a really key element to ensure that we actually see environmental and climate outcomes in our lives. So as Sergio also mentioned, the FTAs are a great vehicle to secure binding commitments on environment and climate. But the EU has also introduced its new approach that is a bit less legally binding, but definitely more amenable and a targeted approach, specifically the clean trade and investment partnerships. Before I move on to our following panelists, Sergio, I do have one quick follow-up question on the CTIPs, and if you could be ever so brief. How do you see the CTIPs and the FTAs working together synergistically to deliver the EU's climate and trade agenda? I'll leave it at that. How do you see that working out together in the end?
Yes, so CTIPs are a new concept, a new generation of agreements, more targeted than FTAs, obviously. I mean, it has taken 20 years for Mercosur to be completed, and even if we hope that it will have an effect on the ground, we cannot wait 20 years for these provisions to enter into force. The CTIPs, we see them as targeted to support the green transition in our partners countries and also in the European Union. And therefore, they are really complementary and they are even do not require an FTA to exist. They are supposed to be agreements that can be negotiated much more quickly and that provide an umbrella, a framework for cooperation, for regulatory cooperation, also for access to the materials and minerals that we need for our green transition, and also to providing value in those countries for the transformation of these products and to create value chains. So overall, you know, we think that they are completely complementary. Now, of course, the CTIP is a new concept. We have just launched it. The first negotiations with South Africa a couple of days ago. I would also recommend that you look at the declaration which indicates some of the elements that we are looking at, but they are very much a la carte. It's not like a menu, a little bit like in our FTA. This is really a la carte, so we will have to be pay the attention on the South African objectives and also the objectives of our own stakeholders of how we can work with business on this, and also in terms of financial support with the financial instruments that we have, both in terms of cooperation, the traditional project, but also with financial institutions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Moving on to our next panelist, Marcus, you're up. As Pierre also mentioned and gave a little nod to you and his introductory speech this morning, you've contributed to research putting forward legal options for the ECF's Future of Trade in a Net Zero World report. And you've also written about how FTAs can contribute to wider climate and environmental cooperation between countries. So my two-sided question is, firstly, how can the EU's climate and environmental agenda be better integrated with its trade approach? And secondly, how could the EU make use of its existing FTAs to build new strategic alliances for climate and environmental action? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. It's always a pleasure to be in the European capital. As someone who teaches EU law outside the European Union in the United Kingdom, we sometimes have a slightly different perspective on some of the things that EU does. So what we have done over the last 3 years was a series of projects, research projects and working papers, looking at the trade and climate change relationship with a special focus on Latin America, creating a community of practice with Latin American-based researchers and really trying to come up with solutions that would work on both sides of the Atlantic. Part of my pro bono commitment is with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, which is a research center based at McGill in Montreal. So there's also a Canadian perspective on some of what we do. That's why I know Chantaline, because she was one of the trailblazers on the trade and environment movement in Canada. What we did, in the first instance, we looked at the draft Mercosur agreement, and I'm delighted to say that the first text version was absolutely subpar, right? It didn't benchmark well against existing EU FTAs. And so we pointed that out. We sort of highlighted where the 2019 Mercosur text that was published fell short, not just in the TSD chapter, but also in the substantive commitments, because I think we need to start taking climate change out of the silo, out of the pigeonhole, and streamline climate commitments across the chapters: agriculture, transport, any part of the FTA really needs to be infused when it comes to climate commitments. So we did that. What we then found that many of the trade agreements and trade negotiations didn't really take the NDCs under the Paris Agreement into account. So we did a study where we compared EU, Latin American NDCs, what do they have in common, and then how do trade commitments undermine or support the NDCs of the Latin American partner country or EU partner country. And you will be surprised. No one seems to negotiate trade agreements with the NDCs under the Paris Agreement in mind. Right? No one even looked at those NDCs as if they are just a PR exercise for the country. We strongly think, and maybe that's a legal lens, we strongly think that the NDCs need to be taken seriously. We need to actually help countries to do what they say they would, and trade agreements need to change in line with the NDCs. So that was the second part. While we were doing the study, we realized that many trade agreements just can't be changed for geopolitical reasons, for in-country reasons, for EU reasons. They're really hard to reopen. So the last phase that we did last year was to look at what can we do with trade agreements when we can't change the text. And you will be surprised. Lawyers can actually come up with a whole bunch of creative solutions. What can be done even if the text is slightly stuck in the 2010s or in the early 2000s, right? Because the objective of sustainable development is firm enough in all EU trade agreements to have coordinated council decisions, to have side letters, to have interpretative declarations, right? We learned that how important these interpretative declarations are in the UK when we had the withdrawal agreement negotiations and a government failed because they didn't achieve the side agreement that they wanted. They only got an interpretive declaration that wasn't really very strong. But nonetheless, it shows us that we can actually, if we're serious about the transition to net zero, and we take climate change, biodiversity, you see the global biodiversity framework pin on my jacket. When we take those commitments that are made at the global level seriously, we can actually agree on joint implementation of the NDCs, taking the NDCs seriously, and have legal commitments that underpin those agreements. So that's what we did in last year, and we published that in a special edition of the journal. We will launch this on the 24th of April. So if you're online, please join that Green Trade Network event that we're launching that research. In the last phase, and now I'm going to your question, we actually try to answer the question, if we take the INSIDE report, the future of trade and climate change seriously, that was commissioned by a future forecasting organization seriously, and what are the legal rules that we need in order to get to that point? And what surprised the entire research team was that there are already really good examples, not just the acts that we've heard about, other examples that are somewhat hidden in EU FTAs that would actually support the green scenario rather than the red scenario or the yellow scenario, right? So these scenarios could be supported by bilateral or interregional relationships. They just haven't been all used in one agreement they've been used in a myriad of agreements. So the task for the future is to bring some of these provisions together. Let me be quite clear. The US is trying to blow up not just the international trade system, not just the international climate system, they're literally trying to blow up all of international law. And that's where the European Union must draw a bottom line, right? So we cannot live in a lawless world. The EU needs to step in and step in hard when the most fundamental norms of international law are being violated by a trading partner. I would go so far to say that maybe trading with a country that behaves so lawlessly should be up for question, right? Even if it's the United States of America. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, and I guess also for adding your perspective on the US tumultuous decisions as of late. I was also thinking in your intervention, thank goodness for trade lawyers and their willingness and ability to put forward innovative suggestions for existing FTAs. I am looking at the time and I'm trying to be very mindful, but I do want to come back to Marcus just to talk a little bit more about the CTIPs, because obviously, you know, the FTAs, the content in those, I mean, there are a lot of existing ones and we know how they're negotiated, they're relatively rigid. CTIPs, you know, there's a bit more opportunity there. And I'd like to hear very briefly your perspective on how the EU could potentially reap maximal benefits for climate and environment while building these new alliances or even deepening existing alliances.
Yes, thank you very much. You know, the international lawyer in me always thinks a partnership or a multilaterally or bilaterally agreed solution is better than anything unilateral, right? So do it together with partners. That seems to be the spirit of the CTIPs. And I think we haven't seen what is planned, right? So I always tell my students, oh, you know, if the German chancellor or the French president travels to Vietnam or China and they sign trade agreements, these aren't trade agreements in the international law sense, right? They're investment partnerships, sometimes between government bodies, but often between private companies and the host country in question. So I can see sort of a mix of an almost contractual investment kind of deal mixed with the framework of an international agreement. I think these CTIPs would work better if there are side agreements to existing FTAs, because the existing FTA gives you a legal framework, and then the side agreement can be much more vague, can maybe involve transfer of funds and sort of commercial commitments if you want. But the existing trade agreement gives you that bottom line. I think they need to take the NDCs seriously, right? We can't just live in a world where every country has an NDC on paper, and because you know, a rogue state tries to blow up the world trading system, we then completely retreat from our environmental or climate commitments. That is not that shouldn't be possible. So I think the best way for the clean trade and investment partnerships would be to actually look in detail, analyze in detail, what does the country that we're trading with, that we're investing in, really want to achieve when it comes to their climate goals, and how can we as the EU help them to achieve their own goals? Because, you know, there's a lot of, oh, CBAM is so neo-colonial. I don't buy that at all. I think, you know, helping other countries to achieve their own objectives is the opposite of colonial, and it's that spirit of partnership I think that the EU could really use. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcus. That brings us to our final panelist, Mathilde. So far we've discussed a lot about existing FTAs and a little bit already about the CTIPs that are initially being negotiated firstly with South Africa. But even before the new commission took office, we saw that there was a shift to secure new and diverse partnerships, for example, the strategic partnerships under the Critical Raw Materials Act. And now we see a lot more of a momentum regarding the finalization of negotiations for free trade agreements. So this approach is also echoed by calls for a quick ratification of the EU-Mercosur FTA. So Matilda, my first question to you is, in your view, is it possible to find a middle ground between responding to geopolitical imperatives without jeopardizing environmental objectives? And if so, how?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the difficult question. I just wanted to mention at the beginning of this discussion also that apart from the instrument that has been raised in the previous session, also the new efforts that were developed by the EU previously and that were important in the strengthening of the requirement in order to access to the European market. There was also the regulation on the forced label, the one on neonicotinoid residues, and the directive on duty of vigilance. And these are also very key new instruments in the EU policy, trade policy. Unfortunately, these are not all fully in place, and some are already challenged, such as the CS3G. And it is not also they are not also very well reflected in the current trade negotiations. So this is one main concern for us. On the specific EU-Mercosur trade agreements, I would wish to say that there's a form to go forward without trampling on environmental commitment, but I cannot simply see how, because it would be creating a lot of contradiction with the commitment that the EU has taken for long years now. First, if priority should be given to reducing our strategic dependencies, I don't see how the EU-Mercosur agreement could serve that objective, particularly in the agricultural and food sector. Then also, we have to have in mind that we already trade significantly with this region of the world, and many flows, such as soy, have already been fully liberalized without establishing strong enough rules to mitigate the impact of this trade. So a study published a few weeks ago by the European Tax Observatory shows that Mercosur countries account for only 6% of EU consumption of cereal and oilseeds, but for a quarter of its pesticide footprints. Because these imports are 4 times more pesticide intensive than the European production. So this could only get worse with the current content of the deal if it was ratified. And also, while Argentina does not have the same geopolitical weight as the United States, of course, the current Argentine government is quite aligned with the US administration on climate change and also the fierce opposition to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agenda. We've seen that in the last National General Assembly at the UN, and also during the last COP, where the Argentinian government recalled his ambassadors just 3 days after the beginning of the meeting. So in this context, what credibility would there be in strengthening our ties with Argentina if it were a friendly country? I really want to raise this question because there was a beginning of new approach at the EU saying that we shouldn't ratify new agreements with governments that are not aligned with these values, such as the Trump administration, such as the Bolsonaro administration, and well, it's the same with the current Argentinian administration. And moreover, the content of the EU-Mercosur agreement is not compatible with the EU sustainability. It's enough regarding the goods and the services it promotes. It will enable European exports of pesticides within the EU, as well as packaging, single-use plastic products also banned in the EU. For the most environmentally sensitive goods, the agreements contain no tariff conditionality based on sustainability, even though the 2009 Sustainability Impact Assessment recommended it. It is not even aligned with the new approach of the EU on trade and sustainability development chapters. And even the recent essential clause that has been added on the Paris agreements falls short on the provision that were previously included with New Zealand and the EU. Now it's, well, in those agreements, the essential element says that it requires the implementation of the Paris agreements, whereas in this current agreement, it will only require parties to not withdraw officially. And also, lastly, the provision added regarding the EUDR risk undermining the robustness of this new EU regulation. So these are all the concerns that we have, and well, we've been trying to actively engage and constructively engage with the EU during the sustainability impact assessment, within the negotiation, within the renegotiation, and we've been formulating together also joint proposal to turn these old-fashioned agreements into a new progressive and modern partnership, less maybe focused on market access and more on more promising forms of cooperation for sustainable development. But, well, we are in a kind of impasse right now, and maybe the most constructive way would be to replace this agreement with a new, more ambitious CTIP with this country or part of those countries.
Thank you so much for that intervention. So yeah, it seems like there's still a big difference between, you know, what's being put on paper and then what's actually being implemented in the free trade agreements, sometimes with varying levels of ambition for climate and environment. Matilda, I still have one more question for you, and then that will be the final question of the panel, and then we'll still have probably about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So get those questions ready. But so my final question to you, we heard Marcus discuss what possible elements could be included in the CTIPs to underscore climate and environment. So I'd like to hear from you what type of provisions should be included to maximize benefits for the partner countries, specifically also from the investment side, because we're talking a lot about trade, but investment is equally as important. So how can we, what provisions should we see to ensure that CTIPs become effective, mutually beneficial partnerships?
Thank you. So yeah, we had a lot of hope with this CTIP announcement. I have to say that I was yesterday at the cabinet of the trade ministry in France, and they haven't heard about the CTIP. So I think there's still a lot of work to do about this idea, how we can work to mitigate those that can provide important insight for this diagnosis, and also based on each partner's strength and national strategy in terms of decarbonization and also the transformation of the agricultural model. So we also think that they should be transparently and inclusively negotiated, which is not the case right now, and the legal scope should be clarified before the negotiation really begin. And also what I wanted to stress is that maybe we need a shift in the approach compared to the trade and sustainable development chapters of the EU trade agreements, which operate under the assumption that the EU is already doing much to implement sustainability commitments and merely seeks to ensure that the trading partners should do more on sustainability issues. I think that there is a lot of room of maneuver to increase the commitment also of the EU. First, to deliver climate finance. Second, to commit to end exports of goods that are banned for our own markets. So I mentioned the pesticides, for instance, earlier. And also maybe the main challenge for the EU would be to reduce its excessive demand for environmentally harmful goods. So with sufficiency targets and a better prioritization of our needs. So the EU it's clear that the EU now has a challenge to secure access to certain resources necessary for the ecological transition, but it should be doing so offering real prospects for exploiting these resources in the most sustainable and fair manner possible, and maximizing the local processing of those resources in the country of origin. And for this, the provision that has been included recently in the raw material chapters of the FTAs are not really the best one. I have the agreement with Mexico in mind. And also ensuring that this access to strategic resources does not generate conflict of use, sorry. And so European Union should prioritize better its own use relative to each other, and also should not take precedence over the domestic consumption needs of the country of origin. And we can see that in the first discussion with South Africa, there's a strong push on hydrogen, and there's this will from the EU to have access to hydrogen, also to import sustainable fuel, particularly for aviation. This has been raised by the Institute Jacques Delors in a recent post, and this might come at the expense of the South African industry needs, also for decarbonation, and this should be carefully assessed in this kind of discussion. And finally, as you asked me, the EU should be more proactive in supporting the agenda of aligning investment protection agreements with the Paris Agreement by refraining from negotiating new investment protection agreements containing an investor-state arbitration mechanism, and by at least favorably supporting the recent OECD proposal to end fossil fuels investment protection in all existing extra EU agreements, because we've been managing our own risk exiting from the Energy Charter Treaty on this aspect, but we have still a lot of bilateral investment deals or investment provision in free trade agreements that are raising exactly the same concern. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so there's a lot to learn for what could be implemented for the CTIPs based on what we have seen previously implemented under FTAs and other existing partnerships. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank my panel for their great contributions, and we'll move to the Q&A part. We have about 15 minutes, so I would like to stress brevity of questions and probably also brevity of interventions. But so yeah, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We have in the front here.
Hi everyone, I'm Yeva from ISD, just one panel, and actually it's an excellent day for us to discussing those new types of partnerships, because today the ISD has published a new publication where we analyze the provisions of critical raw materials in the existing FTAs and in the existing new partnership agreements. And one of the things that we have come out is I think the same conclusion as well, was the idea that it's an excellent, there's a lot of space for experimentation, for the menu that is not yet ready-made. So that's the options that can be formulated based on the interest of the partners as well. But I was wondering, maybe Sergio and you, Marcus, could actually elaborate a little bit more about what could those building blocks be. I think they have been published by the Commission, but I think speaking a little bit more about what is there could be very important. I think another thing is that I think we need to also be very mindful about the transparency here, and the fact that a lot of those partnerships agreements are not really fully available. We can have MOUs that have a secret, or I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but just that have additional action plans that you never get to see and evaluate on exactly what is that delivering to developing countries. So the question is, how can we actually commit to walking that talk?
Great question. We'll take a second one here before, yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead. And then Antoine, and then we'll move back to panels.
Great. I'm Frédéric Lebrun with a firm called South Pole. We are a climate and sustainability firm and carbon project developer. Great points, Marcos, on the integration of and the mainstreaming of NDCs and the Paris Agreement in FTAs. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can use and how FTAs can support the use of cooperative approaches and carbon markets under the Article 66 of the Paris Agreement to facilitate the implementation of NDCs.
And Antoine?
Yes, thank you so much for the panelists. I wanted to raise a point that has not been mentioned. It's not trade policy, it's really not the right forum, but it's a question of sufficiency. The triple planetary crisis, we know that it's largely fueled by our consumption patterns in developed economies, largely. And so sufficiency, demand-side mitigation measures and potential impact has been recognized in the UNFCCC latest publications. And so how can we, from you, Marcus, from a research perspective, you, Jadaline, from the European cooperation perspective, and others, how can this notion, which is fundamentally sovereign, how we manage our own domestic consumption patterns, can be, if any, integrated mainstreams, streamlined into the trade agreements or relationship that we have?
Thanks, Antoine. So yeah, I heard several questions being directed towards Marcus, so maybe you'd like to kick us off?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the shout out on that new IISD critical raw materials paper. I will read it with great interest. I think you're absolutely right. Normally what should be done is to have a full SIA also on these new CTIPs. That doesn't, to my mind, that doesn't seem to be planned at the moment, but it would create participation, transparency, all the things we actually value. The problem might be, from the Commission's perspective, some aspects are purely commercial, right? So we pay you X amount of millions of euros for X amount of critical raw materials. It's really hard to sort of analyze that and make that transparent because, yeah, that's almost like the EU acting as almost like a company or something like that, right? So that is perhaps where this has limitations. But I think very few people, for example, have really studied the discussions of coordination councils, of trade and sustainable development committees. People were surprised that you can have transparency, for example, in the EU-UK TCA dispute settlement, and the world is not going to stop, right? I think more transparency will actually help the EU in the transition to net zero, not less, right? All my students now know what sand eels are and how they are used in different contexts, right? So that's fantastic. I think there are a lot more cooperative approaches. There's still this clinical isolation between climate change and trade, and we see both are currently under attack from a really nefarious government in the United States of America, right? So maybe it's time that the trade community and the climate community could come together. And if they came together, we could have the cooperative approaches from the Paris Agreement, which was basically just negotiated by climate lawyers, also influence how the trade agreements shape up, right? I think once the Paris Agreement credits, the Article 6.4 credits come on stream, I think it's time for the EU to evaluate how much action needs to be taken at home, how much action can be taken in partner countries that have actually been internationally verified. I think there's a lot more potential, and that could be included in a trade agreement. And finally, Antoine, I'd love to say, a trade agreement can solve everything, right? So there may be certain limits of what a trade agreement can do as opposed to all the other instruments that we can use. And for example, I think supply chain legislation, the duty to vigilance is much more effective in changing domestic consumption patterns than an official clause saying we will not import more than X amount of X or Y product, right? So I think let's also be honest about what the limitations of trade agreements are and what cannot be done in a trade agreement.
Thanks, Marcus. I'm looking at my panel if anyone wants to respond. Chantaline, as you already grabbed the mic, and then maybe Sergio afterwards.
Yeah, just like to build on a few things. One, indeed, to Lieva's comment, that is part of the Secretary General's panel on extracted minerals. And basically, 2 points. One, transparency, but the second one is also adding value in country of those critical minerals to not replicate the model that we had before, because these countries need to be able to have green energy themselves so they can actually export to our markets. So I think that's one point. But I also want to build on the NDCs, and I really like the point, Marcus, you mentioned, and also I think Frédéric. So what we did is we looked at 60 NDCs from developing countries and see how they're using trade in their NDCs, and very little. And then we did a pilot with the Gambia and look at how they could use using our draft policy guide for policymakers on how best to use trade and investment policies in your NDCs. And it was enlightening, because the Gambia was like, wow, this is great. So first recommendation, have the trade ministry at the table. Sounds very obvious, but they're not done that way. And then basically, once you have the trade and environmental ministry at the table, problem is they don't know how to talk to each other, because one is climate lawyers, one is trade lawyers, and these two don't speak the same language. So they're like, help us, so I think there's so much work that can be done there, because you're looking at it from the international level, we're looking at it from the bottom up level. And I think and this is where the cooperation could come in. We know exactly what they need, and then on the bilateral and plurilateral support, because they do not have the policy space and the fiscal space, and the capital cost for them to invest is much higher. So we need to address these issues, and there are ways to do it. So I'll leave it at that, but I think that's clear.
Yes, thank you so much for also condensing such an informative answer in just a few minutes. Sergio, you're up.
Yes, on CTIPS very quickly. This is obviously, as I said, a new instrument, so we are developing. Therefore, the scope for input from the outside is very much welcome at this stage. We are also going to be discussing in this particular case with South Africa, because we have launched the negotiations and this will be developed. We are working in full transparency with member states who know exactly what we are doing. So, maybe there's one official that maybe it's a low-level official that doesn't know what's going on, but obviously we are not doing these things without the Council participating, and also, by the way, the European Parliament, that we are going to be working with, even if this is if this at the end is our non-binding agreements, which are subject to different procedural conditions, and the role of the Parliament is different, we are nevertheless going to be working together with the Parliament. In terms of the substance, which some of it still is up for development, there is clearly going to be more than just I buy your raw materials and I pay you the money, because companies can do that, so they don't need us for that, So obviously the challenges are much larger than that, and the challenge is to see how indeed we can secure lines of supply to facilitate the green transition in Europe, but in partnership with third countries, and also facilitating their adding value in that supply chain, and bringing investments to these countries, facilitating regulatory cooperation, making sure that there are no restrictions on the export and on the supply of these materials, and of course doing it in a way that also participates to the local community, creates jobs. For these, there are a lot of different instruments which are required, and trade is not the only one. And we are going to be putting all this, but certainly we need these different aspects, and also questions of demand security are also important, because at the end of the day, we are doing this for a reason.
SIA.
Yeah, so, yeah, why not? I mean, maybe before we close, anybody if it is not in the questions, I would just like to address the comments on Mercosur, on which I generally do not agree at all. It would be a little bit long to address them one by one. But what I can say is that the agreement with Mercosur, upgraded as it has been on the TSD aspects, includes commitments, binding commitments subject to dispute settlement to take effective measures to tackle illegal logging. Also a commitment to halt deforestation by 2030. It includes the Paris Agreement on climate change as an essential element at the same level as New Zealand, even if the language is different. The elements are the same, so one has to remain in the Paris Agreement and, of course, remain in good faith, which means to implement it in good faith. Now, I cannot see how we are better off without this agreement. In terms of sustainability aspects, than with the agreement, I can understand that there may be other considerations, protectionist areas in the industries and some sectors in the economy that may be concerned, and I can understand that. I can even understand that from an environmental perspective, one could say, well, you could have done better, it's always possible, to get more things, but what I cannot understand is if after more than 20 years we have reached this point, we have to scrap this because, it is not good enough, And actually the argument is that, because Argentina precisely, is not very forthcoming, you should not bind them with an essential element clause to the Paris Agreement. Well, actually, that should be the reason why this agreement should be passed, precisely because there are some, stakeholders in some countries that are working against, sustainability, and we want to support those stakeholders in those countries which are working in favor of sustainability. What is the sign that we are going to give to the Argentinian NGOs working for climate, against climate change and for the Paris Agreement, if now the European Union says, well, we are not going to do that, amongst other things, because your government is sending us bad signs, Well, maybe then the next time will be that indeed, some countries will leave from the agreement and we will not have that leverage. Now, the only argument I can understand from a sustainability perspective is that more could have been achieved, it is always, good to get the criticism of the negotiator, but a lot can still be achieved through the implementation of these agreements, as this report that I have just spoke about indicates. Creating these platforms for engagement is very powerful. And even if one believes that some binding commitments should have been improved, which is always possible, of course, although this agreement is better than some agreements which are already in force and have been approved by the Council and by Member States and are not contested by environmental stakeholders who participate in our domestic advisory groups and are actively working in their implementation. So even if the Mercosur agreement is better than some agreements already in force, still it can be much reinforced through the forceful implementation, which is what we plan to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. I can appreciate the emphasis that you've placed on your points. We do need to wrap up, but it would feel a bit unfair to not allow Matilda to make some final remarks, and then we will absolutely move on to my colleague Pierre.
Yeah, I won't respond on Mercosur, don't worry. I just wanted to respond on the sufficiency idea. I agree with Marcus. I think FTAs are not really shaped for that because we have to provide access to markets to a certain extent, so it's really difficult. I hope that in CTIP it could be a new avenue to think about things that could be done on that topic. And also, I think in all the work on the customs, there's also room to work on how to encourage and promote more circular economy in our trade. And this is not easy with the way it is organized today, but it could change with this kind of reform. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Please join me in a round of applause for our excellent panel. I'll hand over to my colleague Pierre to wrap up the day.
And now the challenge is to wrap up in 2 minutes because we have to leave the room at 12:30 precisely. But first, to thank you all for joining us for this interesting discussion, which is only the first one of a series of obviously of Green Trade days. We hope in the future, and that can last for an entire day, not only half a day. Thank you to all the speakers for joining as well, to the moderator for doing such an excellent job. I will remember the powerful words from Laurence Toubiana to be bold and to not hesitate to bring those questions of the interaction between trade and environmental sustainability in different contexts, in different sectors, everywhere possible. We need to seize every possibility and every opportunity to make these issues move forward. And also all the concrete ideas that were brought to the table on how to make CBAM more equitable and how to enhance the solidarity and equity in the CBAM design and implementation. And also, I will remember these very interesting discussions on how to better align different international conventions and how to make use of trade agreements for different purposes. Yeah. Thank you all for joining. And if you haven't done so yet, we have a newsletter. You can subscribe to the newsletter to follow us. And yeah, we'll meet again very soon. Have a great day. Bye.
I'm gonna close it.